Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSat Network. Friend, as you know, we are having discussion on international communication. Yesterday we discussed the major part of it, and basically we discussed the propaganda, types of propaganda, use of propaganda, efficacy, and other aspects of the propaganda. Because this is the main, you can say, main tools to influence the systems of other country used by the different media institutions, or you can say media houses. So we discuss in detail yesterday. We will move further. We'll take up the other aspect, which is very essential to know the international communication and how they are having their impact on the overall system of the country. We can say the different country. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in studio the same resource person, Dr. Sunitra Sen Narayan. She is associate professor in one of the premier institutions of the country, Indian Institute of Mass Communication, and also course director of development communication there, and have keen interest in international communication and development communication. So on your behalf, I welcome Dr. Narayan for EduSat lecture on the topic international communication. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. It's always a pleasure to be here and to meet all of you. Yesterday we discussed propaganda in detail, and today I'll be continuing with this topic in international communications, but we'll be covering a different issue, a different period. We'll be concentrating on the period from 1990 to the current period, and we'll be talking about some of the major theories or models or which have influenced, which have tried to explain international relations and as far as our perspective is concerned, international communications in this period. The period from 1945 to 1990 or thereabouts was actually the period of the Cold War in terms of communication models. Whatever models there were for explaining communication flows actually depended heavily on the structures of international relations, and also there were some theories related to post-colonial kind of theories of, including maybe dependency when we look at models of development and so on. But when we look at international communications in the period from 1990, things have changed radically with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So let's talk about some of these issues today. Till about 1990 or so, the Cold War and international relations provided the background to most theorizing in international communications. In fact, international communications was heavily dependent on theories of international relations at this time. Even a lot of the issues relating to propaganda, they were explained with the underlying framework of, international relations. So during the Cold War, international relations was a conceptual framework, and this sort of depended on the bricks of realism, bipolarity, and containment. Maybe we can take a minute to discuss what each of these means. What is realism, what is bipolarity, and what is containment? Realism, in the context of international relations or international communications, really means that there's the power possessed by a political entity is dependent on tangible things such as the size of a standing army, the number of armaments, munitions, and indeed whether you were a nuclear power or not. In terms of bipolarity, the organizing principle of the Cold War was the presence of two poles or two major powers, which were, of course, the U.S., which led its band of allies, and the USSR, which had expanded to absorb various countries in East Europe and Central Asia. One of the last principles in terms of the Cold War and the organizing framework was what is called containment. Containment was a principle discussed by the American strategist George Kennan, and containment simply means that the Americans were not very keen to see the spread of communism. That they felt the communist or the red threat, as they called it, that should be contained, hence the word containment. What does it mean? Simply that communism should not be allowed to expand anywhere in the globe, and wherever it did, the Americans sought to influence that spread and to control it, either directly or indirectly. So this was the underlying the rationale for the way the world was organized politically during the period of the Cold War, that is the decades of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, right up till 1989 or 1990 or thereabouts. So if we are to theorize how information flows occurred, or what was the principle for discussing information flows in this period, we find it's really dependent on the underlying structure of international relations, with its underlying principles again of realism, bipolarity, and containment. In the post-Cold War period, a theoretical vacuum has emerged as far as an overall paradigm of international relations and international communications is concerned. What we have post-1990 is a very different scenario from what we have during the entire 3.5 decades prior to that. So in the current period, that is from 1990 or thereabouts, it's found that categories such as left or right, or categories such as hawk and dove, are no longer applicable. They belong to the past. If that is the case, then how do we reconceptualize power? Because power is the underlying principle in the earlier models of international relations, which also determined how international communications were structured. So power has been restructured post-1990. If you remember, realism meant hard power. Hard power meant arms, munitions, whether you're nuclear or not. So power in the period following 1990 has been reconceptualized to mean soft power. Soft power is a term first used by the political scientist Joseph Nye, the American political scientist. And soft power means other sources of power which could be dependent on culture, on information, on communication and media. So information has become very important as a source of power, and we find the source of power has become diffused. It's no longer just your army or your military or how many tanks or weapons you have. It also includes do you have the ability to influence an international agenda in terms of news or information? Do you have the structures? Do you have the capacity to set the agenda in terms of information? So this has emerged in the period 1990 as an important source of power. Some of the models and theories of international relations, they continue to be important even in the present day, not only in themselves for explaining political relationships, but also in terms of explaining how the world communicates with itself, how countries communicate with each other, and how the world communicates with itself. So the importance of international relations theories in explaining international communications flows continues even in the period post-1990. Two major theoretical perspectives which have come from international relations, but which we find has applications in international communication and international communication theories are they are Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, again not very new, but it dates from that crucial period around the time the Soviet Union collapsed, which is around the 1990s or so. And another one we'll take is called End of History by Francis Fukuyama, also dating around the time the Soviet Union collapsed. So these are two very different theories. Both of them seek to really explain international relations and political connections between countries, but we find they're closely connected or can explain some aspects of international communications also. Perhaps we'll start with the first one and discuss it briefly before we move on to, what is happening today vis-a-vis theorizing in international communications. So I'd like to start with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. This refers to the emergence of civilization rather than state as a unit of analysis in international relations. What do we mean by this? When we talk about the period of the Cold War, we talk about bipolarity, that is the US and the USSR. We talk about realism. Realism, as we discussed earlier, it shows power to be connected to the army or the number of armaments you have. It also uses the nation state as a unit of analysis. So the nation state is very important in theories of how countries related to each other politically, or how they communicated with each other during the Cold War. Samuel Huntington seeks to go back to older ideas, where he says that post the collapse of the Soviet Union, what is not so important as a unit of analysis maybe is the state, but what we should go back to is civilization. So he uses older ideas of what a person owes their allegiance to, and he says it's not the nation state, it is something more fundamental, it is a civilization. And in fact, he goes back to some older ideas, like even those espoused by Oswald Spengler and things like that, when he talks about civilization and not nation state. What defines a civilization according to Samuel Huntington? What defines a civilization according to him are basic factors such as religion and culture. He says these are more fundamental to whether you have a nationality in a particular country or not. He says what religion you belong to and what culture you're embedded in are crucial in determining where your allegiance lies in terms of a political equation. So Huntington says during the Cold War, the world was divided into the first, second, and third worlds, and this classification or this division was according to the level of development of the country. First, as you know, meant most of Western Europe, the US, Australia, and countries like that, Canada. The second world was the communist world, and the third world included countries like India and countries in Africa and Asia, which had become free relatively recently. So Samuel Huntington feels that in a post-Cold War period, in a post-Cold War era, that is after 1990 or so, countries should no longer be grouped on the basis of their level of development according to first, second, and third world, because the second world has virtually disappeared with the collapse of the Soviet Union. He says a good classification or a useful classification is for countries to be grouped on the basis of their culture, on the basis of their civilization. So he goes back to more fundamental ideas of religion and culture in defining civilization. What is the purpose of his classification? His purpose of classifying countries according to their religion and culture is to give a basis for understanding how communities, how peoples interact, communicate with each other, how they, what will be their political relations in terms of explaining how these work, and also predicting maybe where conflict will arise, which conflicts will degenerate into more serious conflicts, and so on. So his background is obviously from political science, but there are applications in communication theory as well. So Huntington's definition of civilization is a civilization is the highest cultural grouping of people and the broadest level of cultural identity that people have, short of that which distinguishes humans from other species. So it's a very broad definition, and it is at the most fundamental level that it is theorized. So Huntington says that civilizations differ from each other in terms of history, in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of tradition and of religion. So culture and religion are what he gives a lot of emphasis to, but these are tied to other aspects such as history, language, and tradition and culture, of course, generally go hand in hand. So this is the basis of his theory. And on the basis of these principles, which we have discussed, such as history, language, culture, tradition, and religion, he divides the world into the following civilizations, which are this is Samuel Huntington's classification, which is Western. Western, of course, includes America and Western Europe. Interestingly, it also includes Australia and New Zealand. It's not a geographic term. It's more a term which is linked to values and somewhat to religion. His second category is Confucian. Confucian is, of course, Chinese. He suggests that Japan and China have distinct cultures, and he differentiates Japanese civilization from a Chinese civilization. Then he lumps all the Muslim countries together in an Islamic civilization. This includes different cultural groupings within the same religion, such as Turkic, Arab, Persian, and even Malaysian, Indonesian strains of Islam within the same group. Then he takes up a Hindu civilization, which of course includes India. He lists Slavic Orthodox as a separate category from Western. Western he categorizes as being mainly Protestant Christian, and Slavic Orthodox is, of course, Orthodox, that is the Greek and Russian Orthodox streams of Christianity. He lumps most of Latin America, almost all of Latin America, together as a distinct civilization. Because he insists that they have a separate cultural identity, even if they have a Christian religion. And he lumps all of sub-Saharan Africa in one category called African civilization. North Africa, he says, is Islamic, so it comes under the Islamic category. These are the 7 or 8 categories suggested by Samuel Huntington. What is the purpose of this classification? He says that whenever you have conflict between different civilizations, for example, between Western and Islamic, he says that has the capacity to become a very severe or a dangerous conflict, which could escalate into maybe having a large loss of life or material and property loss, destroyed, things like that. He says intra-civilizational conflict is, although it happens, is not to be taken that seriously. It will not probably become too severe in the long run. He takes his examples from, in fact, the Balkans, things like wherever, he calls them the fault lines of civilizations, wherever there are people of different civilizations living side by side. If they have a conflict, he calls that a fault line, and he says that conflict could become very severe and it could degenerate into something which is which could have bad impacts in terms of human life lost and other things. So, as I just discussed with you, he says the most important conflicts will occur along the cultural fault lines of civilizations. This is, as just discussed, is where people of different civilizations live side by side and where they have an area of conflict. The crucial question to ask is, if Huntington's theory comes from international relations, and indeed it does, can it explain international communications in this period after 1990, in the period following the collapse of the Soviet Union? Let us see if we can apply it and if it can indeed explain any communication or information flows in this period. There are certain aspects of international communications which can be explained away by Samuel Huntington's theory. These include communications associated with religious fundamentalism, with ethnic revivalism, anything centered on a particular cultural or religious identity. It can be explained by Samuel Huntington's theory. His theory can also explain different kinds of communication, varying from preaching, proselytizing, spreading the word of any particular religion, uh, and all the way up to hate speech. Some examples of hate speech could be neo-Nazi propaganda on the internet, or preaching. It could also include religious-oriented channels which are available in most countries over the broadcast network. And those may not be hate speech, but they are a form of preaching to the public, and they are founded on the values of a particular religious identity. So, Samuel Huntington's theory can also explain regional communications which arise out of which are founded in a particular religion or cultural identity. For example, the Arabsat satellite system, which um, disseminates Arab language programming mostly to people in the Middle East and North Africa. It could also explain the rise of something like Al Jazeera, which is founded again in a particular cultural identity and the Arab language. So these are maybe some of the aspects of international communications which a theory such as Samuel Huntington's can explain in the period following 1990. However, there has been a lot of critique of his theory. There have been a lot of counter arguments. It may be useful if we look at some of the problems with his theory. While it can explain a few things, there is a lot that it cannot explain. And Samuel Huntington has been severely critiqued even by Edward Said and other cultural scholars on the ground that it takes a very broad view of culture and civilization. For example, it lumps all the Islamic civilizations together in one category. While they may share a religion, they have distinct cultural identities, such as the Arab and Persian uh, civilizations, the Turkic and Malay. They don't really share the same culture, even if they have the same religion. So that is a critique which has been leveled by, amongst other cultural scholars, even Edward Said. So Samuel Huntington's model also, unfortunately, does not explain intra-civilizational conflict or the conflict that happens within a civilization. He seeks to minimize the importance of something like the Iran-Iraq war. But the Iran-Iraq war, although it was between two Islamic civilizations, led to a lot of loss of life, and it was fairly severe and it lasted very long. So it seems difficult to just dismiss it as not being important because it's within a civilization. Lastly, and which is a very important point in today's world, uh, a theory such as Samuel Huntington's cannot really explain the globalization of communications. Uh, Current theorizing on communications, which talks about globalization and the integration of the world, it's not possible to explain this via Samuel Huntington's theory. So there are large areas of communication which it cannot explain in the current context. With that being said, perhaps it's time to move on to another theory which has also been fairly popular in the period following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the period 1990 or so, and that is, in fact, it's often called loosely the end of history. This theory was put forward by Francis Fukuyama, and it talks about after the Soviet Union collapsed, how liberal democracy came to take its place. So, liberal democracy, according to Francis Fukuyama, is the ideal type of government to have, and in fact, it is the way that all countries will evolve in the future, according to Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama is an American of Japanese origin, and he wrote his book. He wrote a research article actually, which came out in, if I'm not mistaken, Foreign Affairs, a leading journal. It was followed up by a book, and it was all it came out around the time the Soviet Union disintegrated. So it became a very popular viewpoint. It became a rallying kind of viewpoint, and it became a very popular theory because it simply said that after the collapse of communism, everything is headed towards liberal democracy, and that indeed is what the Soviet Union has espoused after communism has collapsed. According to Fukuyama, liberal democracy has conquered rival ideologies such as monarchy, fascism, and communism. So he takes a kind of linear view of history where uh, people, civilizations, societies evolve from one stage to the other, and the stages along the way are monarchy, fascism, communism, and ultimately liberal democracy. So, according to Francis Fukuyama, liberal democracy marks the end point of mankind's ideological evolution. In other words, liberal democracy is the end point of a long struggle that mankind has had with different forms of governance, starting from maybe the Stone Age and tribal societies, monarchy, fascism, communism, and finally liberal democracy. He says liberal democracies represent the best form of governance. He said history has shown that any other form of governance is not sustainable, and ultimately a government other than a liberal democracy will collapse, and a liberal democracy is at the end point of the evolution of a society through various stages. Uh, what does his theory actually mean? What are the foundations on which it is built? It's very easy to say, oh, we are at the end of history because we've reached the end point of civilization. But uh, how does Fukuyama explain this? How have we come to this end point? How have we reached there? He says, according to him, history is not a set of events. It is a evolutionary process. It's an ideologically driven process. So, according to Fukuyama, what is driving history in the direction of liberal democracy? Why is history driving a society through these various stages of monarchy, communism, so on, till we reach liberal democracy? According to Francis Fukuyama's view, there are two main reasons why humanity gets to the end point of liberal democracy. These are because science, the cumulative weight of science, it's an important social activity. It is both cumulative and directional. What do we mean by this? For example, science and technology gives you knowledge which helps a society to move from one stage to another. Let's take an example from the field of medicine. The discovery of so many vaccines have helped us to reduce suffering for humanity from childhood diseases. It's helped in elimination of some dread diseases such as smallpox. It's helped in control of other diseases such as chickenpox and polio and so on. So that's one example how science has conferred an advantage and helped society to move from one stage to another. Science and technology also confer military advantages. These are important in relations between countries, but it has also got an economic value. Accumulation of wealth and satisfaction of human desires have also been made possible by uh, the cumulative knowledge that we have collected via science and technology. This is one main driver, according to Francis Fukuyama, which is driving society onwards in a linear way from one stage to the other, but it's not the only explanatory variable. According to Francis Fukuyama, there's also another reason why society evolves from one stage to the other, and that is to do with the individual struggle for recognition. This is a philosophical concept which has an older history from from the German philosophers and going back to Plato and the Greeks. Fukuyama argues that man is not just an economic animal, but he In fact, he's not there just to look at what best he can accumulate, but there are aspects of his nature which depend on self-esteem and things like that, uh, which are best satisfied under the rule of law, which is a democracy, and which cannot only be explained by science or technology. So a person is something more than just a rational or economic. That doesn't mean it's irrational. It means there is more to a person's nature or temperament than simply economics. Um, when Fukuyama devised his theory, he relied on older ideas of the German philosopher Hegel, and according to Hegel, human beings have natural needs and desires such as food, shelter, self-preservation, and dignity or prestige. Prestige, or the desire for recognition, is an old tradition in Western political philosophy. It was first described by Plato, the Greek philosopher. According to Plato, there are three parts to the soul. There's desire, there is reason, and there is spiritedness. And Francis Fukuyama uses this terminology to explain why a person is best off under a liberal democratic form of government. So he goes back to earlier philosophical concepts from the Germans right up to the Greeks, and he describes the parts to a person's soul are desire, which is emos, reason, which is logos, and spiritedness, which is thymos. Thymos is something which Fukuyama expresses as being self-esteem or the desire for recognition. He says that self-esteem is a crucial part of a person's nature, which is best satisfied under a liberal democratic regime, and this is one of the drivers for why a society moves from one level or one form of government to another. So according to Hegel, the desire for recognition, let's go back to this a little. Recognition, spiritedness, thymos, self-esteem, they're all related to each other. So according to Hegel, the desire for recognition and the accompanying emotions of anger, shame, pride are connected to political life, and indeed they drive the historical process. They change the form of governance in a cumulative form from one level to the other. What do we mean by the desire for recognition and accompanying emotions of anger, shame, and pride? For example, if a human being is treated in a way that their self-respect is impacted, or they feel in an insulting manner, they feel anger. If the same human being behaves in a way that they don't live up to their own image of themselves, or they don't meet their own expectations for maybe good behavior, then they feel shame. When a human being maybe works towards something or experiences something which helps them to meet their own vision of themselves or to excel in some activity, they feel pride. So these are the emotions which are connected to this desire for self-recognition, this desire for self-esteem, and Fukuyama translates these innate desires of a human being and connects it to the historical process and the political process. So he says, according to Fukuyama, these two factors of the cumulative weight of science and technology, and also this aspect of a human being's nature which depends on self-recognition or self-esteem, these actually can only be fulfilled under liberal democracy. This desire for self-worth, this desire for recognition, he says it cannot be fulfilled, this need, under communism, because the self-worth is not there. Everything is collective. The cumulative weight of science and technology, of course, are pushing a society in a particular direction. So he says these two factors are what is making history move in the direction of liberal democracy. So this is the background of this theory. Again, like Samuel Huntington's theory, this theory is from international relations. Can this theory describe anything in international communications? After all, it is a theory from international relations. Let us see whether it can indeed explain anything. Uh, Actually, it does help us to explain the globalization aspect of communications, which, if you remember, we discussed earlier. The earlier theory of Samuel Huntington's is unable to explain um, the globalization of communication. In fact, Francis Fukuyama's theory is very useful in helping us to explain this globalization of communications. It can also help us to explain aspects such as privatization of communication, privatization of telecommunication structures. You would be aware when the Soviet Union collapsed that the existing broadcasting structures in these countries, some of them continue to be run by the state, some of them were taken over by other private companies. In any case, all these countries saw the rise of private media, both in the broadcast and also in terms of newspapers. So, the media space in many of the former Soviet countries became very open, and there was more competition than before. And there was also private media as compared to the earlier media, which was tightly controlled by the state. While these are aspects of communications and international communications that can be explained by the theory of Francis Fukuyama, uh, one critique of this theory is while it can explain aspects such as globalization of communication, while it can explain privatization, liberalization, not only of communications but specifically of telecommunications, it's not very good at explaining what Huntington's theory in fact can describe, can explain, which is speech, or which is communications arising out of religious fundamentalism, out of particular cultural or ethnic identities and groupings. It's not very good at explaining that. So these are two models that we have taken up for discussion at some length today. But there are many other models out there. Some of them are from international relations. Um, so it seems as if no single model is enough to explain the variety and the scope of communication flows in the period following post-Cold War um, era. In fact, with the growing globalization of communications, more and more we find that maybe theories from which look at the world in terms of post-modernity or things like that maybe could explain different kinds of communication flows. Uh, However, it would appear that unlike Samuel Huntington's view that the nation state is not that important, we find that in fact the nation state persists as a unit in political science and reality, and indeed also in terms of communications. Many communication flows still emanate within a particular nation state. Uh, what is becoming more and more difficult to theorize, maybe also in terms of globalization of communications, is the new media, because as you're aware, not only does older media like satellite communications cross borders, but new media such as the internet is becoming increasingly hard to say what is a national communication, what is a international, what is a global, because convergent media like the internet, uh, it crosses all boundaries. It doesn't respect any nation state or any identity. So the technological change that we are seeing is making it harder for us to theorize specifically related to a particular nation state and particular categories such as international relations. Propaganda still exists, but propaganda may be growing more subtle in different ways. But propaganda, although it was a category which was very popular during Second World War and surfaces in every war, it's also there in peacetime. but it may be becoming more subtle along with technological change. What does seem to be a trend that is happening is that media itself as a category, as a player in international relations, is becoming more and more important. As we find that the nature of power is getting diffused, as power is becoming um, inclusive of soft power, which is information and communication, in addition to hard power. So the importance of media in setting the agenda and determining political equations is becoming very important, which is why we are seeing maybe the desire for countries to set up their own international news channels to broadcast into other countries, to spread their own language programming. It's a way of getting of affecting the international agenda and getting your own opinion to matter more. So, does this imply that in today's world now, international relations is no longer important as a basis for determining international communications, or should we look at a model of communications which can explain the other way, how politically people are connected? Is that a reality? Well, we don't know, the way things are headed. And what does seem to be important is that media in many ways is becoming more pervasive in people's lives. Maybe the form of the medium is changing. Maybe in future it will be more on digital, it will be more on mobile, it will be more on people accessing maybe internet on their mobiles. People in poorer countries such as India, the penetration of internet is still very small, but the penetration of mobile is huge. So maybe in the future we'll see more and more people accessing the internet via cheaper mobiles. So that could be a huge area where which has ramifications for even how international communication and global communication will happen in the future. So that's a kind of just a broad overview of some of the theories that have made a big impact in international communications in the last 20, 30 years or so.
So, when we see the evolution of communication, international communication theory, we find that it has some elements which contradicts to the interest of the nation, or you can two nations. So, in that case, how in the present day world, how a consensus could be raised to serve the purpose of the all countries?
A consensus in terms of what?
Not to have adversely affect the culture, or you can say the belief system of the particular
you
country.
mean cultural imperialism?
Yeah, that kind of
Okay,
things.
cultural imperialism, as you're aware, was a outgrowth of more dependency theory, and it led to this whole debate about the New World Information Communication Order and the McBride Commission. But this fear about cultural imperialism has receded somewhat in the last 20 years or so. For the simple reason that all developing countries are not really passively just receiving content. There are some centers of, in fact, media production in the developing world, and I'll name a few. There is India, there is Brazil, there is, of course, China is in a category by itself, there is Egypt, there is Mexico. All these countries are large producers of content, and they are exporters of content. In the case of India, we export a lot of films. We have a very vibrant film industry. We export also our channels, our private entertainment channels are receivable for our diasporic communities across the world. A country like Egypt exports a lot of, in fact, entertainment programming to other Arab speaking countries. Brazil and Mexico are both producers of a lot of entertainment content, and they're exporters of it. So, when you talk about cultural imperialism, yes, if you're a small island country, maybe you're just receiving content all the time, you could suffer from cultural imperialism. but in a broad way, it's hard to make the argument that all developing countries are suffering from cultural imperialism. When you take the case of India, you take the case of some of these other countries, the picture is actually much more complex, because what we are seeing in India actually is globalization. We are not seeing straightforward globalization. What do I mean by globalization? Globalization is a term that's grown out of marketing literature, which means you take a global advertising campaign, maybe for a product which is a global product, such as maybe Coke or Levi's jeans or something like that, and you run it across different countries with local adaptations to take into account values, culture, language. But basically, it's a global product, often marketed and sold by a multinational. It's available in many countries worldwide. It's a consumer product generally. It has its main purpose is to make profit for the entity which produces it, and it is sold with local variations, and so it's not straightforward globalization. This has grown out of advertising and marketing literature. It's more like you use the local values to sell a global product. How does this impact communication flows? This impacts communication flows in the sense that today, not only is it present in the realm of advertising or marketing, but it's there when we look at genres of programming. You take a program such as Indian Idol. Indian Idol is part of the whole series, like American Idol or British Idol or whatever. So this runs across so many countries, and it's the same format, it's the same concept, it's the same idea, but it's there in different countries with the local languages, with the local players, and it has a different appeal. So you can classify a program. It is not straightforward cultural imperialism, because our own film songs, our own culture is being propagated via this program, but the format is not Indian. The format is a very Western format. That's only one program. You have many such programs. Even the hugely popular Kaun Banega Crorepati was based on a foreign program called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And we can argue that yes, it is cultural imperialism. It's inculcating the values of consumerism or things like that. But the picture is actually more complicated. It's not straightforward cultural imperialism, like we understand that because we're watching this, we're changing our clothes or changing our diet radically or changing our values, which is at the bottom of every debate. It's not that simple. It's a little more complicated now.
No, that is true. The globalization we have adopted, not globalization but globalization. But are we popularizing the local communication? We can say communication at local level.
Local
Yeah.
or global?
Whatever term we can give it.
I would say that local communications are becoming very popular, because if you look at theories of communication and culture and identity, there is one group that says that we are having cultural imperialism. We are having because of cultural imperialism, we are tending towards cultural homogenization. That is, everybody will one day end up maybe speaking in English, wearing Levi's jeans and drinking Coca-Cola and Pepsi, and so on and so forth. There is the other group which is the group of cultural heterogenizers, which says that anthropologically there are certain things which are distinct, which globalization cannot really remove, that they will continue to be distinct way into the future. I think the middle path is more accurate to describe some of the things that are happening in India in terms of cultural hybrids. What we are seeing is not clearly that we are being globalized by an entity. We are having a lot of multinationals come in with their impact on advertising, on marketing, but we are seeing a lot of Indian enterprise rise too. Let's not forget the huge growth stories of Indian regional programming. We have very viable regional language programming in all languages. We have seen the rise of the Indian Hindi language broadcasters who have become national broadcasters, who are competing with Doordarshan in so many categories. We have seen the rise of so much Indian enterprise in our software and technology sector, that we are world leaders in so many aspects of the development of content. Uh, we we are not straightforwardly just copying anybody. Maybe we copy something, but we introduce our own element. So, I think more and more we are tending towards a hybridity. You know, globalization has been discussed by social theorists called Arjun Appada in terms of there are some trends such as there'll be a media scape, there'll be in this landscape of globalization there are factors such as financial integration, the flow of people migration, the flow of ideas, the flow of media, the flow of money, which is financial investment. So he said these are all aspects of globalization. But in India, we're seeing that, but at the same time, we're seeing the rise of local media houses. The Hindi language newspapers have been a huge success story in terms of circulation in the last decade or so. So what is happening, some trends in the Western world where they're seeing fall of circulation of newspapers, of disappearance of certain editions, of um, lesser jobs in the media sector is not necessarily happening in India, because in India we have to take into account that we are getting more and more literate people joining the audience every year. More and more people are reading newspapers for the first time, they are watching more television, maybe more radio, because we are getting more literate people also into the pool. As education becomes universalized in future, even we may have larger audiences, which is directly opposed to what is happening in some Western countries, which are really struggling with dropping circulation figures, at least of their mainstream newspapers.
Okay, so in a way we can say we are in a win-win situation, both sides.
In a way, yes. In terms of our media, I believe that we have a healthy, vibrant media, but certain aspects of our media are worrisome. Uh, we need, it is my personal opinion that certain forms of regulation may be put into place. In terms of ethics, we have problems in our media in terms of accuracy of coverage, in terms of gender issues, stereotypes shown on media. These are all problems that we suffer from. So I don't think we have any reason to be complacent. But in terms of actual audience size as compared to other countries, yes, we have the figures. In terms of actual quality of coverage, we have still issues where there's a lot of room for improvement.
Mhm. So, what are the steps which need to be taken up as you outlined? These are the problems if you want to sort it out at priority basis.
Well, maybe we can go back to the issues of international communications. I think in future the world will actually be more and more and more connected in terms of communication flows. Today, any child can produce anything and put it up on YouTube, and it has a viewership all over the world instantly. So I think more and more we have to recognize the fact that we are going to be more connected in some way or the other. So I think we need to evolve some maybe mores of what is acceptable in terms of content, uh, in terms of speech, in terms of content, which is which can be viewed by all groups, even children, minorities. So we need to make some basic provisions for things such as privacy, for the sensitivities of various groups.
Okay. So, well, friends, as you heard today, we have seen that there are changes occurring all over the world in international communication, and significant change have occurred, and that has helped in a many way to overcome the basic problems which were previously the country were facing, like illiteracy, poverty, etc. Through technological advancement we come to know how we can overcome it, and we have been successful in this. And as far as the international communication is concerned, we have come a long way, but still a longer way we have to go. Only then we can be at equal footing. So with these words we conclude the lecture, and I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf I thank Dr. Sunetra Sen Nayan for giving such an insightful lecture on international communication, and giving us an insight how to look at these things with different angles. With these words, I thank her again and thank all of you watching this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. I'm very honored to have been invited here to deliver this lecture. I hope it's been of some use to the students. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.